How many have ever been out of the country before? How many have ever traveled out of the country? How many have ever been to Rome? Okay, so a couple of years ago, I was on my way to Cairo, Egypt, to teach a bunch of missionaries a graduate course in missions, which is weird. And so I fly to Rome, and I'm getting off the plane, and it's one of those things where I have to change my bags, pick up my bags from the carousel, and put them on another carousel. And as I'm standing there, I used to fly Delta all the time. I'm standing there, I get an alert from Delta that says my bags are headed to Boston. Well, that's problematic because where I was going in Cairo, I didn't have an address. I was just supposed to meet some missionaries at a McDonald's, and they were going to find me. They're going to take me to where I needed to go. It was that kind of situation. So I'm stuck. I'm like, I can't go to Cairo without my bag. So I rearranged my flights and had to spend 2 days in Rome. It's the first time I'd ever been to Rome in my life. And when in Rome, no pun intended, you do what Romans do. And so that morning, I get up and I take a train into the city center, and I go to the Vatican. And I wanted to see everything there was to see in Rome in 24 hours. And I saw the Colosseum, I saw the Trevi Fountain, I went to the Roman Forum where the heart of the Roman Empire was. I looked at all the arches, and then I go to the Vatican, and I wanted to see the Sistine Chapel. Now, the Sistine Chapel is where they select the next pope. That's where they have what's called papal conclave. They bring all the bishops or the cardinals in, and they select the pope, and they put fire, and there's a certain color of smoke that says we selected the pope. And so I wanted to see the Sistine Chapel, not because I wanted to see where they were selecting the new pope, but I wanted to see it because it's painted by Michelangelo. It actually took Michelangelo standing on a scaffolding for 4 years, hand painting this beautiful ceiling. Now, I've seen pictures of the Sistine Chapel. How many have seen pictures of the Sistine Chapel? You know, there's the famous iconic picture of God touching man right there in the center. And what was amazing with the Sistine Chapel, I don't know what I was thinking. I just thought, okay, it's just going to be a nice little painting on the ceiling, and I'm going to go, cool, and I'm going to walk out. When I walked into the Sistine Chapel, I literally gasped like, ooh. Because not only was the entire ceiling painted from front to back, hand painted by Michelangelo, there were frescoes on either side of the wall, one depicting the entire life of Christ and one depicting Moses's life. And the whole thing was this beautiful display of art. Now, they said you couldn't take pictures, but I tried. I kind of did one of those things like, where, didn't really turn out, but all of a sudden, by standing in the middle of the Sistine Chapel, I got this understanding of the perspective of it. How big, how vast, how beautiful. Perspective is everything. Perspective is everything. Once I saw the Sistine Chapel, I realized why Michelangelo hated it so much. He actually said his spine became knotted up from painting for 4 years straight, the ceiling, this beautiful work of art. And you think about it as you're painting one little detail, how do you see the entire canvas? But yet he did it. Perspective is everything. And I've got to be honest with you, perspective in faith is everything. It's everything. Now, in the Gospel of John, John writes 7 signs and 7 sayings. So the Gospel of John is not a normal gospel. You have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're known as the Gospels, but really Matthew, Mark, and Luke are what's known as the Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic meaning same. They're very similar. They come from a similar source. Their stories are the same. If you read one, you kind of have read all of them in a way. But John's completely different. Because John's purpose in writing the Gospel of John is not to eyewitness testimony account of kind of things that Jesus did. John's writing a theological account of who Jesus says he was. So he frames up his entire book with 7 sayings, and he frames up his entire book with 7 signs. And when you get to the end of the Gospel of John, he actually tells you what he wrote the book about. John chapter 20, he says this. Now, this Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe. So John's whole purpose of writing his gospel is not to just give a life and times of Jesus, but so that you believe. And so as we open up John chapter 11, I want to kind of give you a little bit of context. And I think there's no better story to look at than John chapter 11, because it's a story of Lazarus being risen from the dead. Now, what we don't often connect to is this is right before Palm Sunday. We typically read the Bible in isolation and read a story here and a story here and a story here and don't really connect the dots. But this story happens right before Palm Sunday, and it's rich with theological insights. We see a glimpse of how God acts with humanity, how God deals with us, and we even see glimpses of his character. So let me give you a little bit of context about John chapter 10, and this may be different than what you've ever heard before. This may be a different form of preaching, but please stay with me. John chapter 11 happens right after John chapter 10. I didn't know if you knew that. But John chapter 10, Jesus leaves Jerusalem. Now, what you have to understand is Jesus's primary ministry was never in Jerusalem. It was in the Galilee, some 90 kilometers away. So Jesus would only visit Jerusalem during important festivals or important seasons. He doesn't live in Jerusalem. If you've ever been to Israel, you immediately realize how far the distance Jesus had to travel from Nazareth and Galilee all the way to Jerusalem. But in John chapter 10, Jesus leaves Jerusalem, and if you remember, people wanted to execute him. The climate was getting more and more intensified every time Jesus came into the city, and he would be back in just a few days. But when he came back, there would be a plan to execute him. Before that time, Jesus spends a little time outside the city, and this is where our story picks up. John chapter 11, verse 1 says this: Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany. Bethany was a few miles away from Jerusalem, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of Man may be glorified through it. Now, a couple of things you have to understand right away. Jesus' best friends were Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. Oftentimes on his way to Jerusalem, he would stop by and hang out with them. And while we don't know what Lazarus is sick with, we can kind of pick up some context clues of how quickly the sickness happened. Jesus is in town for the Feast of Tabernacles in Jerusalem, and with Bethany being so close to the city, there is no doubt that Mary, Martha, and Lazarus would have been in the city with him. We don't see anything in Jerusalem where it says Lazarus is sick, Lazarus is at home. More than likely, Lazarus was in the town with Jesus, and then he gets sick. So the illness happens super, super fast, but the death happens even faster. Within a couple of days, Lazarus dies from this illness, and what is peculiar is how Jesus actually handled it. Not only did he respond pretty glibly, and instead of rushing to Lazarus' aid, he decides to stay where he's at for 2 more days. Look at it in John chapter 11, verse 5. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Skip down to verse 11. After saying these things, he said to him, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'll go wake him up. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. Now, Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought he meant he was taking a rest and sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died, and it's for your sake. Look at the language. I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him. So Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let us also go that we may actually die with him. Strange, right? He's actually glad that Lazarus that he wasn't there. He loves Mary and Martha and Lazarus so much. So what is Jesus doing here? Why is he just acting so glib in the moment that his best friend, by the way, is dying or dead? I mean, think about it for a second. Jesus loved Lazarus so much that Lazarus is the only character in any of Jesus's parables that is actually named by name. All of Jesus's characters in the parables have no name except for one parable, and that's the rich man and Lazarus. He only uses Lazarus because he had a deep connection and he wanted people to understand the wrestling in that certain parable. So Jesus had a deep, deep love and appreciation for Lazarus, and yet he just sits on his hands and do nothing. Now think about it for a moment. What if you got a call from mama? I'm not feeling good, sweetie. I'm just cool, mom. Like we're skiing in Lake Tahoe. You'll be fine. Or, hey, mom, you'll be good. We're at the beach right now. I mean, do you think mama would appreciate you just hanging around while she's getting sicker and sicker and sicker? This is what's going on. Jesus gets this report. And he's like, it's all right. He'll be fine. It's no big deal. And then when he gets the report that he's dead, he looks at his disciples and goes, I'm glad he's dead for your sake. It's weird, right? What is Jesus trying to do? He's trying to give them a perspective of who he really is. He's glad because in this moment, he is going to show them that he is God in the middle of chaos and death, and he's about to bring life back into the situation. And this is what Jesus does. We see it over and over and over again in the gospel. Jesus stands in the middle of the storm. He stands in the middle of sickness. He stands in the middle of the religious, and he proclaims and brings renewal. And this is the mission of God, to stand in the middle of darkness and to bring light, to stand in the middle of hurt and brokenness and bring healing. This is the mission of God. And this is what's happening here. Jesus, in a few short hours, will walk towards Bethany, and he'll stand in the middle of their darkest period. Jesus is trying to show the disciples, he's trying to show Lazarus, and he's trying to show Mary and Martha that the new creation is here. And that's what he's about to do. So Jesus finally gets on his way and starts heading towards Bethany, and he's greeted on the road with Martha. And there's no doubt she's deeply hurting. Her brother's sickness turns to death, and it's final. So look at verse 20 in John chapter 11. He says, so when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, and I don't think this is a passive conversation. I think Martha left her house going, I'm going to give Jesus a piece of my mind. And she comes out and she says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give it to you. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Now, Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. And Jesus said, no. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet he shall live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? And she said to him, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. So while I believe that Martha believed that Jesus was from God, her theology for a moment needed a bit of a bump. See, Martha refers back to the end times resurrection. Yeah, I get it, Jesus. Lazarus will rise from the dead one more time at the resurrection. And Jesus is going, no, you don't understand. I'm not a teacher. I'm not a prophet. I'm not a moral example to follow. I am the Christ. I am resurrection itself. Now, think about that for a moment. What does that mean for you? So many times we come into church and we sit on our hands and we wonder, is God ever going to meet my need? Is God ever going to move? Is God going to provide for me? Is God ever going to heal? And we sit on our hands and we go, well, I guess one day he will. Maybe, possibly. You know what you need? You need Jesus to step in the middle of the situation and to remind you that he himself is resurrection. So that sin you deal with on a regular basis can be crucified on the cross and you can raise to life again a new creation. That sickness you have that you've been holding on to, that illness, that disease, it can be eradicated by the resurrection. So Jesus is saying, see, I told you I was going to teach, and now I'm like, preaching. So look, I lost my train of thought there for a second. I was on a roll. But think of what Jesus is saying. He's not saying that's off in the future. He says, Martha, it's now. It's now. The new creation, listen, it starts now. When Jesus rose from the dead, all the earth, that all us believers rise with him, and the new creation starts now. See, our salvation is both present and future. Rather, I would say it's past, present, and future. We're saved from our past sins. We're continually being saved, and one day we'll ultimately be saved. So Jesus says, I am the resurrection, meaning that I am presently gonna do something in your life. It's one of the most powerful statements Jesus has ever said. And it's like he's saying, Martha, I know you're struggling. I know that you believe in the resurrection, but I am it. Think about it. I'm not sure in church history who died first. I've tried to look it up many, many times. Was it Mary, Martha, or Lazarus for a second time? But what if it's Lazarus? What would be going through Martha's head as she buries her brother for a second time? I think she would think, well, I've seen Jesus resurrect once. He will do it again just as he promised. Her perspective in Jesus changed, and her belief was solidified by his demonstration. Now, when Jesus gets on the scene, decay has set in. For 4 days, Lazarus has been in the tomb. Now, oftentimes what they would do when they'd slide you into one of these holes, it was kind of like a little slot, they would just slide you in, they would put a rock in front of it, but they wouldn't seal it. You know why they wouldn't seal it? Because in the cold, damp atmosphere of a tomb, there were records of people actually kind of being resuscitated and walking out of the tomb. It's weird, within the first 24 hours. But Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. Have you ever smelled anything that has been dead for 4 days? Rot and decay takes over really, really fast. If you don't believe me, go take a piece of meat, put it outside, and leave it there for 4 or 5 days, and then just bring it into the house as potpourri. It stinks. Decay has set in. Jesus has stayed long enough where decay has set in. And he waits until this tomb is completely sealed so that there's no mistake. This isn't Jesus bringing somebody half dead back to life. This is Jesus reversing decay in people's lives. It's remarkable. With one word, Jesus' voice transcends space and time and calls Lazarus out of the grave. Think about it for a second. You're Lazarus, and you have been up in heaven for 4 days. You're like, this is awesome. I'm young, lost some weight. Streets are wonderful. I'm in the presence of God. This is wonderful. Lazarus. I mean, this is the greatest moment of my life. I don't ever want to go back to earth. Lazarus. This is awesome. Lazarus. What? Lazarus. You're sucked back into earth. All of a sudden, you're wrapped as a mummy in grave clothes, your eyes open, and you're staring at a coffin, basically, or a stone that's right in front of your face, and you're like, well, that's great. I'm back here. But with one voice, Jesus pulls him back to the reality. The story is so fascinating. Jesus is demonstrating who he is. With his voice, he will roar, and the dead will be renewed and made new. When they unwrapped Lazarus, he's not sick anymore. He's not corrupted with disease anymore. He's not decayed anymore. In this story, Jesus completely restores him. When I read this story, I look at the five main characters. There's Jesus, the disciples, Martha, and Mary, and Lazarus. They all had various perspectives, and Jesus wanted to change those perspectives. He wanted to reveal who he was. He needed to demonstrate to each character that he is who he says he is. So let's go through it for a second. We're about to be done here. But the disciples needed their perspective to move from fearful to fearless. If you look at verse 7 in John chapter 11, it says this, then after this, he said to his disciples, let us go to Judea again. And the disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews who were just now seeking to stone you, there are Jews there that are seeking to stone you, and you are going there again? Jesus had just dodged the proverbial bullet, according to the disciples at the end of John chapter 10. They wanted to get back to the Galilee where it's relatively safe. And they're having a difficult time. And by doing this miracle before their eyes, he's hoping that this would be the sign that would solidify their belief. From this event, in 10 days, they would be confronted with the most fearful thing they could imagine, his arrest and his death. And as a matter of fact, these guys, John tells us, were so fearful after the crucifixion that they locked themselves in a room and began to hide. Now, can you imagine as the disciples are sitting there hiding post-crucifixion, and all of a sudden the Holy Spirit reminds them, don't you remember like 10 days ago how Jesus stepped to a tomb and roared with his voice and brought dead back to life? Why are you hiding? Why are you putting yourself away from everybody? Why are you scared? You serve somebody that you have seen do miracle after miracle after miracle after miracle. In one of the Gospels, as Jesus is arrested, a young soldier's ear is cut off. Jesus picks up the ear. The guy's name is Malchus, and I love that they named Malchus in the Gospels. You know why? Because somebody during that time could go to Malchus and go, hey, Malchus, like, tell me the story of what happened in Gethsemane. He put his ear back on, like in the midst of chaos and arrest and violence, Jesus reaches down in the dirt, grabs an ear, and slaps it back onto somebody. I mean, that's weird. And these disciples are hunkering down, fearful of their lives. What happened? How is it that these people who are in abject fear move from fearful to fearless? I mean, 50 days later, they're in that same city proclaiming the resurrection to everybody. Thomas hops on a boat and goes to India somewhere around AD 52, maybe 10 years or 15 years after this, and dies by a spear. What happened? All of a sudden, somehow, the dots started connecting that this God that they serve is true and is real. These disciples needed to have their perspective shifted. Martha needed her perspective to change from doubt to full of faith. The story makes it clear that Martha went back and forth on her belief. She was having her own doubts. She really wanted to believe, but she was grieving, and it's difficult to believe that Jesus could do anything. Look what happened even after Jesus tells her that he will raise him from the dead. Verse 39 of John chapter 11, Jesus says, "Take away the stone." And Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, by this time there will be an odor, and he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" You see, Martha needed this resurrection to remove all doubt from her mind. In order for her to truly believe in Jesus being the Christ, she needed to see this powerful demonstration. Christ, in that moment, removed all doubt. Mary needed the perspective of a compassionate God. If you look at John chapter 11, verse 32, it says, "Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, 'Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died.' And when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, 'Where have they laid him?' And they said to him, 'Lord, come and see.'" Verse 35, Jesus wept. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who had opened the eyes of a blind man also have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone laid against it. Now think about that statement for a moment in verse 35, that Jesus weeps. Jesus already knows what he's about to do, and yet he still weeps. You ever thought about that? It's odd. Why is Jesus weeping in this moment? Why is he so moved emotionally? Here's my perspective. Here's my thought on it. My theological 2 cents, if you will. Jesus is weeping, number one, because the people needed to see him weeping. They needed to feel his emotion for the moment. But I think he's also weeping because he's seeing the consequences of sin in people's lives. Romans tells us that sin leads to death. No matter how righteous you are, no matter how good you are, no matter how much you come to church, pay your tithe, no matter how many times you serve on any of the church teams, sin leads to death, which means all of us are going to die. Happy Sunday. Right? Oftentimes we try to avoid it. We don't want to think about it. But listen, I'm 48 years old. I'm not 28 years anymore. Like this morning, I take my first step out of bed and I feel like death creeping in on me, you know? It's like, oh, that hurt. You know you're old when you start injuring yourself in your sleep. It's the truest thing I've said today, right? Jesus wept because he saw the consequences of sin play out. And Mary needed to see it. Mary was broken. She put all her faith in Jesus, all of it. Mary was the one who took an expensive bottle of perfume and washed Jesus's feet with her tears and the perfume. She loved Jesus. She believed in who he said he was. And yet she's broken. And what I love about this moment, about Jesus weeping, is he shows us that he cares about the little things in our life, even though he knows he's going to fix those for us. Amen. He cares about our hurt. He cares about our longing. He cares about our brokenness. Jesus ultimately cares. It's a beautiful moment. And what is so amazing about Mary is just in a few days, she's not going to see one person resurrected. She's going to see two. Her weeping is ultimately going to turn to joy when she discovers him resurrected. And finally, Lazarus' perspective needed to move from death to life. There's a reason why the story of Lazarus is so significant. It's an appetizer to Jesus' resurrection. Jesus loved his friends so much that he waited in order that they might believe through the next difficult week. Think about that. Jesus pauses because he goes, I'm going to have to show them resurrection physically for Lazarus so that they believe resurrection in 10 days when it's me. He needed to change their perspective that death is not the end. Death is simply the beginning. Every funeral I've preached, and I have preached many funerals for believers, I stand up and remind them that death is not the end. Death is always the beginning. We are a new creation that will be resurrected one day with new bodies and new minds, and we will live and reign with him forever. Our perspective has to change. This earth is not our home.